This is a production of Cornell University Library.
So now to our book talk. I'm honored to introduce you to our speaker today, Leslie Overstreet, who is the curator of natural history rare books at the Smithsonian Libraries in Washington, D.C. And we were chatting with Leslie earlier and saying we all know someone else at the Smithsonian. So Leslie has an undergraduate degree in English literature and a master's in teaching, awarded by Reed College in Portland, Oregon. She joined the staff of the Anthropology and Vertebrate Zoology Libraries at the Smithsonian in 1980. She's earned her master's in library science in rare book librarianship from the University of Maryland and has been working in the Special Collections Department of the Smithsonian Libraries since 1988. And since 2002, she's headed the Smithsonian's Joseph F. Cullman III Library of Natural History. That's a mouthful. In her work at the Smithsonian, Leslie collaborates with scientists, historians, and institutions such as the online Biodiversity Heritage Library to build the Smithsonian's world-class collections and connect a wide variety of patrons with the rich archive of knowledge that these collections embody. Leslie has published extensively on the topic of natural history books in special collections, and a major focus of her research has been on Mark Catesby's classic work, The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands, which was first published in London between 1731 and 1747. She served as a consultant to the documentary film The Curious Mr. Catesby, which was produced by the Catesby Commemorative Trust and has been broadcast on public television stations across the U.S. In a book of the same title, published by Georgia University Press in 2015, Leslie contributed the chapter describing the printing history of the Catesby classic. So please join me in welcoming eminent Catesby scholar Leslie Overstreet.
Thank you very much, Mary. I am more than flattered, indeed a little intimidated to be here, but very grateful for the opportunity and the honor of speaking to all of you. As Mary mentioned, early in my career at the Smithsonian Libraries, I took care of the 4 vertebrate zoology divisional libraries for about 6 years. And after I had moved to special collections, every now and then, every couple of months, I would get a phone call from one of the researchers in birds who asked to come and look at a book. I brought it out for her. She sat there. She just leafed through it very slowly, about half an hour, took no notes, just looked, and would go away and come back a couple months later, do the same thing. So I had a look at what this book was, and I became similarly enamored of it. I'd never heard of it. The Natural History of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands by an Englishman named Mark Catesby, published in the 1730s and 40s. The Smithsonian has a magnificent copy of the book, and in fact, it's a rather magnificent book. And we're even luckier to have 2 additional copies of Volume 1, which is what set me on my now more than 20-year quest, because each of those 3 copies is different from the others in one way or another. And here's a picture of one of our sets. Before we get, though, too deeply bibliographical, a little bit of context. Oh, can the lights be dimmed a bit, or the shades drawn? I don't know what will make it look better. While they're doing that, I'll give a little bit of the bio. Mark Catesby was born in the village of Castle Hedingham, near the town of Sudbury in Essex, to a perhaps minor gentry family. They were well off, they owned property, but not aristocratic or anything. His two older brothers were both sent to university, but as a younger son, Mark was not. And after a basic standard education of the period, he seems to have taken an interest in the natural sciences, botany in particular, and through, I think, his late teens, perhaps into his 20s, he sort of apprenticed under an uncle, his mother's sister, Nicholas Jekyll, who lived in Castle Hedingham and was a close colleague, I believe, of John Ray, who was the premier British naturalist of that period, lived in a neighboring village in Essex. And so Mark got a fairly thorough grounding in the botany and zoology of the day. In the 17 teens, his sister sailed to North America to join her husband, who was a physician and in the, well, not entourage in a pejorative sense, but served with the colonial governor in Williamsburg in the colony of Virginia. And Mark accompanied her on this voyage because he was very curious to see a wider world of plants and animals. He was there for 7 years, presumably on his own dime, and I'm guessing that he ran out of money eventually and returned to London. Because he had been corresponding with relatives and colleagues and sending specimens as well during the 7 years, he was becoming known to the circle of naturalists in London at the time, indeed within the Royal Society even. And a couple years later, a number of members of the society sponsored him to return to North America for a second collecting trip, explicitly to focus and send them back all kinds of specimens and seeds and such. That was 5 years, and then finally in 1726, he returned to London. At that point, he was determined to publish his observations and drawings of the plants and animals of, wrong button, of North America. And as you probably know, in Catesby's day, there were no publishing houses as we know them to foot the bill of producing a book, buying the stocks of paper and ink, the copper for the engravings, paying the typesetters, the printers, the engravers, and so on. Instead, an author had 3 choices. Have a patron who would pay all of these costs. But Catesby's sponsors from the trip had said that they would not be extending their support. Secondly, you could sell the work to a printer or bookseller who would see it through the press and own the rights to it. Or you could pay for it yourself, which meant that you had to come up with the initial capital, you took the risk of losing money if the book didn't sell, but you owned the rights to your work. And of course, if it did sell, you got to keep the profits. Catesby was able to choose that last option thanks to the help of his most stalwart supporter, the Quaker merchant Peter Collinson, a member of the Royal Society and the central node in an extensive network of naturalists, travelers, collectors, and wealthy patrons. Collinson loaned Catesby the initial capital without interest to get started, but even with that, Catesby could not afford to hire a professional engraver to transfer his drawings into copper plates for reproduction in printing. So he sought out a professional artist, Joseph Goopy, to teach him the art of etching. Once he was ready to begin in 1728 or 29, he had this proposal or prospectus printed up. This is from the Smithsonian Library's copy, one of perhaps a half dozen known to survive. And I'll just mention that all of my slides are from the Smithsonian's copy, unless otherwise noted. And all of them are my own photographs, so I'll apologize in advance for their lack of professional quality. The proposals describe the intended contents of the book, Catesby's qualifications, his supporters in his travels, and the emphasis on illustrations based on first-hand field observations. And then he lays out the specifics of how he intended, to issue the work. Same one. First, by subscription, an increasingly common way at this time of funding expensive books to ensure a buying market before launching into full-scale publication. Secondly, in parts. Catesby was writing the text, etching the coppers, and at least initially hand-coloring every print. So getting the book out was going to be a very time-consuming process. He planned to publish parts of 20 pages of text and their corresponding 20 plates every 4 months. And although he found it impossible to stick to that schedule, the subscription fees paid by the part would start coming in to keep the publication going. And finally, he says he's going to be publishing 2 versions. A regular one with the plates in black and white for 1 guinea per part, and a slightly larger one, imperial paper, with the plates hand-colored for 2 guineas apiece. Virtually all known copies of the book are fully colored, and it had been assumed that the plain version was dropped by Alan Stevenson, among others, in his classic bibliography of the Hunt Library. But I have found 2 uncolored copies at the Chelsea Physic Garden in London and the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, which I hope to investigate further. And finally, at the very bottom, the specific booksellers where sample drawings could be seen and subscriptions entered.
Leslie, if I may, he lists among those encouraging his work some very notable individuals.
Oh, yeah.
Like Hans Sloane and William Sherrard.
Yes, very definitely. They were major supporters. As you'll see in a moment when we talk about who subscribed, Hans Sloane stepped up big time. So, as was common with subscription publication, Catesby included a list of the subscribers in the book. Such lists were normally printed at the completion of the work, and this is proved in Catesby's case by, for example, the title following Martin Folkes's name, President of the Royal Society, which he became only in 1741. But the list would normally be bound at the front of Volume 1, and the catchword at the bottom of the verso of that encourager's leaf indicates that Catesby meant it to go directly in front of the preface, as we see here. The encourager's list has 155 names, from European royalty to the farmer naturalist John Bartram in Pennsylvania, to whom Catesby gave a copy in thanks for his help. And a few, like Sir Hans Sloane, right, there we have it, who ordered 5 copies of the book. Several of the names, the ones with dashes after their name, are booksellers who handled subscriptions and post-publication sales. And we can only guess at how many each of them sold. But all told, I would guess that Catesby sold perhaps as many as 180 to 200 copies. The first part was out by May 1729, and the others followed slowly but steadily. The other 4 parts that completed Volume 1 appeared at the latest by January 1730, November 30, December 31, and November 32, according to the dates on which he presented each part to the Royal Society. And I'm assuming they're basically hot off the press. I mentioned that we have 3 copies of the book and that each is different in some way, and a close examination of the text in those copies, and most especially in the 3 at the British Library, which I was able to have all at once spread out on a big long table to make direct side-by-side comparisons, reveals that there are actually multiple typesettings of the first 4 parts of the book, with changes in a variety of points, including the decorated initials, the line wraps, and in a few instances, even the wording. As one example, this is page 37 in our main copy, and up close you can see, I hope it shows up well, that there are labels glued on correcting the heading for the English paragraph and the citation for the plant's Latin name. In our second copy, the same page has those corrections in type. And actually, there's quite a few differences between these 2 typesettings. The initial I is different, as are the line wraps, most notable at the ends of the paragraphs, the spacing between the headings and the text, the position of the signature, and so on. Pretty conclusively, new settings and not just stop-press corrections. These separate settings suggest that Catesby, operating on a shoestring, had started by keeping the number of copies that he printed, and therefore his costs, very close to the actual number of subscribers, and thus had had to go back and make additional copies at least once, and in one case twice, to bring late arriving subscribers up to date. The different typesettings can be placed in a sequence. The earliest has various errors corrected by labels or by hand, and the last incorporates the corrections in type and most conclusively appears in a later incarnation, as I'll explain a little further on. So it seems possible, to the extent that a copy can be traced back to a particular owner, that we could determine roughly at what point in the book's publication that person subscribed, and more generally, how many subscribed at different points over the course of the book's publication. Unfortunately, only about a dozen copies of the 70-odd that I've examined do have a provenance that goes back to an original subscriber. But of those, the key players in London, the Royal Society, for example, that Catesby gave a copy to, Peter Collinson, for instance, have the earliest version of Part 1, as you would expect. While further afield, the copy now at the University of Stockholm that was owned by Queen Lovisa Ulrika of Sweden, who had a large collection of natural history specimens and in fact employed Linnaeus to catalog them, has the second typesetting of 3 for Part 1, and then the earlier of 2 settings for Parts 2, 3, and 4, suggesting that it took a while for her to hear about the book, but then she was quick to sign up. And in fact, that's exactly the pattern of the copy of the first edition here at Cornell in the Kroc Library. The second typesetting of Part 1 and the first of 2, the earlier of 2 for Parts 2, 3, and 4. On a larger scale, the material evidence of these different typesettings and their relative numbers provides information not only about the practical aspects of book production in the mid-1700s, but also, for example, about scientific communication networks in this period across national boundaries and oceans. Among the copies of the first edition that I have data on, the 3 typesettings of Part 1 are fairly evenly distributed. 30% have the first setting, issued in 1729. 26% have the second typesetting, and 39%, the largest group, have the third and last typesetting. I haven't been able yet to actually date the later typesettings, but I suspect that they came not earlier than 1732 with the decision from Part 5 forward to expand the print run and accommodate later subscribers without having to go back and pay the print and the typesetter all over again. So those percentages suggest that a significant proportion of the total signed on well into the work's production as word and interest spread. So these differences appear only in the first 4 parts, 20 pages and plates per part. That means pages 1 through 80 of Volume 1. Because finally, with Part 5, Catesby seems to have become convinced that the book would sell adequately to cover the costs, and he took to making enough extra copies to accommodate additional subscribers through the remaining 15 years of the book's publication. He completed the 5 parts comprising Volume 1, 100 pages of text, 100 plates, primarily about birds and trees, in November 1732, as I said. And with the last part, he included, as was customary at the time, the title page, printed and dated, perhaps in anticipation, 1731, and a dedication page for the volume. Unique to the copy at the Smithsonian, attached to the bottom of this inserted leaf is this little note. It was apparently sent to subscribers at the same time as the last part and the title page of Volume 1 to warn them that there would be more prefatory material, a frontispiece, a preface, maps, and that they should not have the volume bound yet. As I'm sure you know, until the later decades of the 18th century, virtually all books were bound only at the point of sale or even later, with the buyer deciding what kind of cover he wanted or could afford. Catesby proceeded with parts 6 through 10, comprising Volume 2, covering fish, reptiles and amphibians, mammals and insects, from 1734 to 43, significantly more slowly than the first 5 parts, in part because by now he was actively participating in the meetings of the Royal Society. With the final part in 1743, he issued the title page and dedication for the second volume, and the list of subscribers, and an index to the whole work, along with those extra bits he had promised, an 8-page preface, a map of the parts of North America in which he had traveled, and a 44-page account of the country. He never did produce a frontispiece, although I have seen copies where one of his plates has been moved to that position in front of the title page. But again, with these last parts of Volume 2, he sent out an announcement saying that he planned yet another part, 20 pages and plates, to add plants and animals that remained from his own collections or had been sent to him after his return to England. The advertisement, of which I've seen only one other copy besides ours at the Smithsonian, alerts the subscriber to leave room for that additional part by having the binder insert tabs or placeholders for it when binding, note, only now, both volumes. I was delighted to discover several years ago a copy at Trinity College in Cambridge that still has those tabs waiting for the appendix, which in fact they have, but bound separately. It took another 4 years for the appendix, as Catesby called it, to appear, accompanied by its own index. But by 1747, the book was finally complete. 11 parts, totaling 220 plates, 220 pages of text, plus 2 title pages, 2 dedications, the list of subscribers, the preface, the map, the account, and 2 indices. 20 years of Catesby's life had been devoted to producing this work. He died only 2 years later, after completing it, at the age of 66. He had single-handedly produced what became the most important and influential book on the flora and fauna of North America for the better part of the 18th century. It was authoritative and distinctive in several ways, in its comprehensiveness, in its illustrations based on field sketches, and in depicting animals in conjunction with plants from their natural habitat. It was cited by his contemporaries even before Volume 1 was finished, and by successors such as Gronovius, Pennant, Forster, Bloch, Buffon, and most significantly Linnaeus in the Systema Naturae, whose 10th edition in 1758 cites Catesby's work repeatedly. Of the 180 to 200 copies sold, I estimate that about 100 survive. And one of the more interesting things about them is the considerable variation in the contents of the two volumes and in their sequence as bound. For starters, many of them are incomplete. Some lack the appendix, and quite a few lack one or another of the prefatory bits. The Cornell copy, sadly, is incomplete in this way. It's missing the last part and the appendix. Many copies have much of the prefatory material, especially the account and the map, in Volume 2, indicating that the owners did not wait to bind Volume 1, as Catesby had instructed. And there were a few copies that have the appendix bound as a separate Volume 3, the Trinity copy I just mentioned, and the Bradley Martin copy, if any of you are familiar with his collection. The owners, again, apparently either missing or deciding to disregard Catesby's instructions for the binder about fitting it into Volume 2. But the Smithsonian Library's copy, with that note and advertisement to guide its owner, is both 100% complete and bound in the correct intended sequence. It's one of only a handful of perfect copies, and I believe the only one in the world with all three of those pieces of ephemera relating to the production of the work. The unique authority of this copy is supported by the fact that the original owner, who put his armorial design and monogram on the cover, was Cromwell Mortimer, the Secretary of the Royal Society and a subscriber. 5 years after Catesby's death, in 1754, his colleague George Edwards saw a second edition through the press for the benefit of the surviving family. And I'll mention that all photos of the second edition are from the copy at the Rowan Public Library in North Carolina. Although the title page says that the work was, quote, revised by George Edwards, just below Mark Catesby's name, not a word has been changed, as is proven by the fact that among a dozen or so copies of this edition that I've seen, many, if not most, are made up with at least some, and in one case, 100% printed sheets of text left over from the first edition. They're identifiable by these large decorated and, in fact, pictorial initials, often incorporating birds and trees. And it was these distinctive initials that made it possible to identify the printer of the first edition, who is never mentioned in the book itself. Only the booksellers where you can buy the book are listed on the title page. And it turns out that the printer is an otherwise fairly obscure man named Godfrey Smith in Spitalfields, London. The first edition sheets are used in a seemingly random mix with newly set text that can be identified by its different sets of initials in a completely different decorative style, full of all those curlicues and things. The newly set text in the second edition also added Volume 2 to the direction line of each page that carried a signature in the second volume. So here you see that, the signature D at the bottom and Volume 2. Excuse me. They did it only in Volume 2, presumably to distinguish the two volumes' pagination runs for the binder, since they were both being published at the same time and might easily have been mixed up. Interestingly, the newly set text reintroduces some errors that had been corrected in the first edition. For example, in the first edition, this is page 54, and up close, you can see that the typeset word, which had been red, is erased and overwritten black by hand. You see it in the second to last line. But in the second edition, the text reverts to red. Different line wrap, but again, red in the second to last line. Although the plate has the bird's legs colored black, as they should be. It would seem that the typesetter was working from an uncorrected text, but the leftover first edition text sheets that Edwards was using had it right. They were the later corrected version. So this is kind of a bit of a mystery as to who was using what and why these errors recur. The pattern of these occasionally reintroduced errors is something that needs looking into and may provide evidence, as the multiple typesettings of the first edition are evidence of Catesby's cautious approach to print runs, of how Edwards went about producing the second edition. The plates in the second, again with some possibly left over from the first edition, most likely uncolored until they were needed for the second, were printed from the same coppers, but tend to be noticeably more strongly or brightly colored. A third edition was published in 1771 by the bookseller Benjamin White, who made a specialty of books in natural history and who had purchased Catesby's etched copper plates. To judge from the handful of copies that I've seen, this edition consists of new set text, this time with plain capital letters. The text includes volume identification on the signature line in both volumes, and the appendix carries on both the pagination and the signature sequence from the main text. So instead of a new chunk of pages 1 through 20, it goes from 101 to 120. And there you see it up close. The third edition also added a catalog of Linnaean binomials for all of the plants and animals in Catesby's text. Although I haven't yet studied the third systematically, in the copies that I've seen, it's obvious that, again, some of those textual errors reappear. Here's our friend, page 54. And up close, you can see that the text reverts to red again, this time in the third line up. And now, the colorist has chosen to follow the text instead of previous copies of the book. And this holds true through all of the copies of the third that I've seen. The plates, again, are more brightly colored than Catesby's original first edition, and they also provide evidence that the third edition stayed in print for 45 years. Although the text and the dated title page are the same in all of the copies, various copies contain plates on either laid or wove Whatman paper with watermark dates including 1794. Can make it out upside down and backwards in this one. This is from the Cooper Hewitt Museum copy. All the way up to 1815, here in a privately owned copy. And the Cornell copy is on paper watermarked 1815 and 1816. White seems to have very cannily printed off a large supply of the text all in one go, since you have to pay the typesetter, and it's a very time-consuming, laborious process, in 1771, but produced the plates in batches as the market could absorb them, with the added financial benefit of limiting the cost of printing and hand coloring the plates to only a portion of the total at any one time and spread across years apart. As the first fully illustrated work on the flora and fauna of any part of North America, based on years of firsthand observation in the field, Catesby's work was enormously important and influential throughout Europe for the entire century. And as a result, several European works came out in the 1750s and 60s translating the text into German, Dutch, and French, with illustrations copying Catesby's images but re-etched by others. The first was on the birds, titled Sammlung verschiedener ausländischer und seltener Vögel, translated by Georg Leonard Huth and published in parts in Nuremberg from 1749 to 1770, covering volume 1 of Catesby's work on the birds and then the birds that had been added in the appendix, combined with George Edwards's Natural History of Birds. The French and Dutch versions published in the 60s and 70s used the same plates, which were etched by Johann Michael Seligman, copying Catesby's and Edwards's originals. And as you can see, the plates include the vernacular names of the animal or plant prominently positioned. They sometimes have additional background elements, and they are signed at the bottom by Seligman. And Catesby is all acknowledged on the left normally. It's quite small. You probably can't quite make it out in this one. The images of animals in Catesby's volume 2, the fishes, reptiles, and so on, were re-etched by Nikolaus Friedrich Eisenberger and Georg Lichtensteger in another work, and the text again translated by Huth, also published out of Nuremberg. So, if you're interested in examining Catesby's magnificent book for yourself, I'm happy to say that both the Smithsonian's main copy of the first edition and the variant of Volume 1 have been digitized from cover to cover and can be studied page by page in the Biodiversity Heritage Library online. And of course, you have a copy here right on campus, and Volume 2 is on exhibition in the Kroc Library. I hope you will go see it and enjoy it, and I thank you for your attention. Oh, I'll be happy to answer questions or just mingle and chat, depending on how you'd like to. Or Evelyn?
I might have mentioned this. How much did it cost? How much did it cost the subscriber? How rich would you have had to be to actually afford it?
Pretty rich. It cost since almost all of them were colored, it cost 2 guineas per part, 11 parts over 20 years. So it was one of the most expensive books of the day. And in fact, Linnaeus complains about the expense of these fancy folio color plates books, that the average working naturalist cannot afford them. I don't know how it translates into modern dollars, but it would be quite expensive. And a number of the people listed in that, what I've called subscribers, he calls encouragers, are people to whom he gave a copy, I'm pretty sure, like Bartram. He sent him bits at a time in thanks for the specimens and information that Bartram was sending actually to Collinson and through Collinson to Catesby.
And do you know where the Bartram volume is?
No. It's not at Bartram's garden. I've been working with the staff there. Sorry? Sorry, no. But they do not have Bartram's library. It passed, I'm trying to track it down because I have a suspicion about our third copy. But it passed to his daughter, who married but had no children, and her library was sold at auction in Philadelphia in the 1800s, but I cannot find a list of the books that were sold, so I don't know. Yes.
I read someplace that his first work, his first paintings, had no background. It was just...
That's right. The first 8 plates are just the bird. And I think at that point, he began to realize, oh my God, I've got way too much. This is going to take me forever. So he began putting a plant, normally a tree that the bird associated with the bird. And the rest of the whole first volume has usually a bird and a plant. So you're right, the first 8 were just the bird.
He must have made all the drawings before he went back to England.
He had field sketches, but the finished drawings were made back in London.
So he was doing this in part with memory.
And specimens. He
And
had.
He did bring back specimens.
Oh yes, lots. In fact, his herbaria survives, and specimens as well of some of the birds and animals. But he had the sketches from the field as well.
Do any of those sketches survive?
Well, I don't know about field sketches, but his original watercolors do. Yes, there's 270 odd that belong to Queen Elizabeth, and they live in Windsor Castle. If any of you are going to be in Charleston, beginning in May through the summer, there's going to be an exhibition of the original watercolors from Windsor at the Gibbs Museum of Art. And it will be only the second time that they've come to the United States to travel.
When you were describing the illustration process for the original edition, you referred to both engraving and etching. Which
I
is
shouldn't have, I'm sorry. They're both intaglio processes, but Catesby etched. Engraving is a much more difficult skill because you're actually gouging a line with a tool out of copper. In etching, the copper is covered with a wax. You draw through the wax to the metal and then just dip it in acid of very kind, and the acid etches the lines where the metal has been exposed. Much easier, and all you need for that is to know how to draw through the wax. And then, of course, you remove the wax and you have the etched lines. So Catesby's were etchings. I'm sorry. So, okay, good. Well, let's have some little something to eat, and I'll be happy to talk more or answer questions as we mingle.
This has been a production of Cornell University Library.